If it's Monday, ceasefire suspense. Israel's war cabinet meets after Hamas says it's accepted a ceasefire proposal brokered by Arab officials that includes the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners. Plus, former President Donald Trump lashes out at his legal troubles, comparing the Biden administration to the Gestapo as supporters rally behind his incendiary rhetoric and unfounded election conspiracy theories, including his vice presidential hopefuls. And Donald Trump is held in criminal contempt for the 10th time for violating his gag order again, as the judge sternly warns the former president that he may throw him in jail as a last resort. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Mychael Schnell in Washington, where we are following breaking news out of the Mideast. Israeli officials and the White House are reviewing a potential ceasefire deal from Hamas. Arab officials hope it will end hostilities as the IDF prepares for a ground offensive in southern Gaza. This afternoon, Hamas's political wing announced it was accepting a ceasefire framework brokered by Qatar and Egypt, as U.S. officials were also in the region. Israeli officials quickly responded, saying they were examining the agreement, but Israel also noted that the deal was not the framework mediators had previously agreed to. Israel's war cabinet met tonight and decided to send a delegation of mediators to continue talks. The suspense over a potential ceasefire deal comes after President Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke by phone this morning. Earlier, National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby told reporters the president has been briefed on the latest response and that the situation was highly fluid.
We're currently reviewing that response, and we're discussing it with our partners in the region. Director Burns, as you know, is there, and he's working this in real time on the ground. We still believe that reaching an agreement is the absolute best outcome, not only for the hostages, but for the Palestinian people, and we're not going to stop working to that outcome.
The developments today come after talks looked like they were on the brink of collapsing over the weekend, with Israel forging ahead with plans for ground operations in southern Gaza, despite humanitarian objections from the White House. Overnight, the IDF dropped leaflets over eastern Rafah, urging approximately 100,000 Palestinians to evacuate and move to a new expanded humanitarian area. Here's more from John Kirby this afternoon, reiterating the White House's concerns.
We don't want to see operations in and around Rafah that make it harder for the people that are seeking refuge there and shelter to be safe and secure. And we have made that case privately to the Israelis. The president did it again today with the prime minister directly. We certainly made it publicly. We've been very, very consistent about that.
Ahead of any potential ground offensive last week, the White House halted a large shipment of weapons to Israel, according to two administration officials. The shipment included 2,000-pound bombs and other ammunition that would likely be used in Rafah. NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez joins me now from Tel Aviv, and NBC News' Gabe Gutierrez is at the White House. So, Raf, what's in this proposal, and what is the Israeli response to it?
So, Yamish, what we have right now is a discrepancy between what Hamas has agreed to and what Israel has agreed to. And the key question in the coming days is, can the gaps between these two proposals be bridged? Now, our understanding of what Hamas has signed on to is a three-stage proposal, each proposal 42 days each. And in that first stage, Hamas would release 33 Israeli hostages. Those would be hostages from the so-called humanitarian category. So it's women, it's children, it's the elderly, it's people with serious medical conditions. In exchange, Israel would release more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. There would be that ceasefire, and we expect that Israel would allow a large number of Palestinian civilians displaced from their homes in northern Gaza to return home. Now, Yamish, as you said, Israel's war cabinet met earlier tonight. They have not outright rejected this Hamas version of the proposal. They are sending negotiators back to the talks, so they feel that there is enough here that is worth talking about to continue these negotiations. But at exactly the same time, they say the war cabinet unanimously decided to continue this military operation in Rafah, long threatened by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Earlier today, around 100,000 Palestinian civilians were told to evacuate from the eastern part of the city to head to so-called humanitarian zones. At this point, there is no official confirmation that Israeli ground forces have entered Rafah. An Israeli official told me earlier that would ultimately be a decision from the Israeli government, and the exact timing of the ground offensive would depend on how long it takes for those Palestinian civilians to get out of the way. Yamish.
And Rafa, I mean, with all of that still in suspense, what happens now? What kind of backlash specifically could Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu face if he rejects this deal, but also if he goes forward with this ground operation in southern Gaza?
So a lot of pitfalls for him here. There have been large protests tonight here in Tel Aviv. The families of Israeli hostages who for 7 months have been demanding that their government make a deal to bring their loved ones home. They have been out on the streets around the Israeli Defense Ministry saying, do not let this chance go. Hamas has agreed to a proposal, bridge the gaps, find a way. But Yamish, Netanyahu is also under pressure from the far right of his cabinet, including his own national security minister. This is a man who voted against the last ceasefire proposal. He tonight is out in public saying that Netanyahu should reject this deal, should move ahead with the ground offensive. And as you heard from John Kirby at the White House, the Biden administration remains opposed to any large-scale ground offensive in Rafah. They say Israel has not come up with a credible plan to get those million-plus Palestinian civilians out of the way. What we don't know yet at this point is whether what we are seeing in eastern Rafah is the beginning of that large-scale operation, or if it's something more targeted in response to Hamas firing rockets yesterday, which killed 4 Israeli soldiers. And even, Yamish, if this is an elaborate way of Netanyahu putting more pressure on Hamas at the negotiating table by threatening to move his forces forward in Gaza. Yamish.
Rob, thank you so much for all your reporting on this highly fluid situation from Tel Aviv. And Gabe, I want to come to you. President Biden spoke with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just this morning. What else do we know about that call, especially as all of this has been developing?
Hi there, Yamish. Good afternoon. Well, we just found out from the White House that the call lasted about 30 minutes. And as we got the readout earlier this morning, the Prime Minister and President Biden spoke about this ground offensive in Rafah. And the president made clear his position, according to John Kirby, that yes, the administration is opposed to any large-scale invasion of Rafah, as you just heard Raf detail. But what we can also add is they really talked about humanitarian assistance quite a bit. And Prime Minister Netanyahu committed to reopening the Kerem Shalom international crossing that had been shut down overnight following the death of those Israeli soldiers. So certainly it's indicative of ongoing tensions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden as this situation unfolds. But the White House trying to make it clear that they have open lines of communication, and they wrapped up this call earlier today. Yamish.
And Gabe, we've seen the president's rhetoric really change and evolve when it comes to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I wonder how much more could this situation, especially if there is a ground operation in Rafah, how much more could that up the tensions between these two leaders?
Well, quite a bit, Yamish. Look, the White House has been saying that U.S. policy towards Israel could shift if there are a large number of civilian casualties in Rafah, if Israel proceeds with this offensive in a way that does not protect civilians. It remains to be seen what that shift in policy might be. But certainly, yeah, that's a concern that the relationship between Israel and the U.S. could potentially deteriorate even further, Yamish.
And as we talk about this situation, there's also a key player at the White House today. President Biden in a meeting with Jordanian King Abdullah. Do we know anything more about that meeting and what impact that could have on sort of the situation as it unfolds?
Well, certainly they discussed the situation in Gaza, according to the White House. We don't have a formal readout of that meeting just yet. We understand it was more of an informal meeting, a lunch that wrapped up a little earlier today. But of course, a very key player in this region. The president was discussing watching this ongoing situation. News of the acceptance of Hamas's acceptance of a potential deal actually was breaking during that time.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for all your reporting from the White House. Joining me now is Jonathan Deckelchen. His son, Sagi, is believed to be among the hostages still being held in Gaza. So thank you so much for being here, Jonathan.
Thank you. He's not believed to be amongst the hostages. He is amongst the hostages.
Thank you for making that clear. We wrote believe, but you're right. He's your son, and he is with Hamas right now, unfortunately. So I want to talk to you, of course, about this situation. Israel is still reviewing their response, but what's your reaction to hearing that there might be a ceasefire framework that be agreed to by these parties?
Well, and I'm not privy to the goings-on in the cabinet or amongst the military officials in Israel. What I can say is the vast majority of Israelis understand that in order to get the hostages home alive, or at least as many as possible who are still alive to get them home, as well as the bodies of those who have already been murdered, that has to happen by some sort of negotiated process. There may be some military pressure that accompanies it, but at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of agreement between Israel and Hamas, as distasteful as it is for any government to have to negotiate even indirectly with a savage terrorist organization. But it has to happen. And in this case, there are intermediaries. And I think it's a relatively good sign, although we'll only know when it's done. It is a relatively good sign that the Israeli cabinet decided to send our negotiators back to the table. They had been withheld for the last couple of days, which was very disappointing to hostage families and all of their supporters in Israel. So perhaps there's a little daylight here, and there can be progress in this negotiated process.
I also, of course, it's now been 7 months since your son was taken by Hamas. Could you tell us a bit about your son and how you and your family are dealing as all of this has been happening?
Well, Sagi, he's a 35-year-old father now of 3. His youngest daughter was born about 5 months ago, 2 months into his captivity. In fact, he doesn't know if his wife and 3 daughters survived the massacre on Kibbutz Nir Oz, our home, on October 7th. He was taken from the kibbutz along with 80 other members and residents of our kibbutz. Civilians, all civilians, ripped from their homes, along with 40, we believe now more than 40 of our people who were massacred on that day by Hamas terrorists, our homes looted and then destroyed by civilians who walked over the border from Gaza. October 7th was the explosion that set off this horrific chain reaction that we've all experienced since October 7th, leading to the horrors, and we all see them, the horrors in Rafah and throughout the Gaza Strip. And Hamas could have ended it yesterday or today or tomorrow by releasing the Israeli hostages. And it's infuriating and frustrating. And I do hope that we've gotten through the good offices of the intermediaries to a place where Hamas is willing to say yes, and by saying yes, ends the suffering of their own people and the captivity of Gazans, who are in fact captives of Hamas, not quite like our Israeli captives, but very much captive of the barbarism of Hamas.
As you talk about this infuriating situation, as you put it, there are hostages that would be released as part of this deal. Women, children, the elderly, those with serious medical conditions. That being said, some may not be released, especially when you think about the hostages that don't fit that category. What do you make of that and the fact that that suffering will continue even if this deal goes through?
Well, from what we've heard, it should come in stages. So the first stage, indeed, would be the women and the young children who remain there, and the elderly and sick. But the idea is that that's stage 1, and in stage 2, a few weeks later, another group would come out, and then at some point not too long thereafter, the final group would come out. From what we understand, that's mainly soldiers on active duty that were taken hostage. So, I mean, there has to be a first step at some point. It would be better for all if there were a deal on the table that would end the conflict right now and return all of the hostages very quickly. But there isn't a deal like that on the table. This is the one that's at hand. I can't speak to what Hamas presented to the Israeli government today. It hasn't been put out there in any kind of detail. But I think that's the framework in general. And those of us, like myself, whose loved ones probably will not come out in the first stage, will be thrilled, as we were thrilled in late November, early December, when over 100 hostages came home, not my son and not many others of my friends and extended family from the kibbutz, but we were thrilled for them, and we'll be thrilled for whomever still can come out. The big question, Yamish, and we don't have an answer to this, how many of the 132 hostages are still alive? Yeah. I do not know if my son's alive. I know he's in Gaza, but there's no way of knowing. I believe in him, and I have faith that he's a survivor. He's the grandson of 3 Holocaust survivors. He has surviving in strength in his genes, but the conditions are horrific in the tunnels. This we know.
Certainly a horrific situation, and one that we'll keep following. But also, I want to say thank you so much for your time, for sharing so much of your family, for your son, but also your granddaughter. I appreciate you talking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And joining me now on set, it's NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and Chief Washington Correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming here. I know you have a lot going on, so I appreciate you making the time. So tell me a little bit about what you're hearing about if this deal could possibly fall apart and sort of what happens next.
I don't think it's a deal yet. And I think the problem is that it's Hamas, one branch of Hamas, Hania, accepting a deal that is not exactly, not in fundamental ways, similar to what Israel offered. It is a permanent ceasefire immediately, which is not what Israel has ever agreed to, nor would ever agree to. At the best that the U.S. could hope for was a 6-week ceasefire that Bill Burns has been negotiating for many, many weeks, that could then be extended if no one broke it, and extended until it became de facto a permanent ceasefire. But up front, Israel is not going to agree to a permanent ceasefire. They still say that they want to get elements of Hamas, as many as 4 battalions, out of Rafah. And they are threatening, unhelpfully, the U.S. believes, threatening to go into Rafah now. There are, in fact, just some reports of rocket fire and talking about going into Rafah even before this deal was announced by Hania. And Hania is only one part of Hamas. It's not Sinwar, the more militant leader who is believed to be hiding in the tunnels underground in Gaza and was the mastermind of October 7th and has not agreed to anything all along.
And you are, of course, just in the region with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And now, of course, as you just said, the CIA director is there. How much do you know about how people are leaning in on all the parties to try to get this done in this hour?
It's huge pressure by Qatar and Egypt on Hamas. And Hamas is basically resident in Qatar. Aside from Sinwar being underground in Gaza, the other Hamas leaders live in Doha. And there's a big issue right now as to whether they will be permitted to stay there, whether Qatar is going to be pressured to have them leave. They've been subsidized by Doha with the complete understanding of Israel. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that Israel, endorsed that because they thought that was keeping them in one place and keeping them sort of contained. Well, they learned on October 7th, tragically, that was not at all the case, and that there was a militant part of Hamas, if not all of Hamas, that was dedicated to this surprise attack, which was, a wholesale massacre. In any case, I think the deal, it's hanging on a thread. There are a lot of strong Arab leaders in the region who want this to happen and are pressing them for it to happen, as well as, of course, the U.S. But there is a big distance between where Israel is right now and the U.S. In that phone call today, it was very clear from what John Kirby said and what other sources are saying that the president was pressing Netanyahu not to keep hammering Rafah, and also saying that the U.S. is not at all satisfied. He said this on the record. Yeah. The U.S. is not satisfied that there is a a plan for taking care of the people, 1.4 million people in Rafah, that they have not provided that plan, nor have they provided a satisfactory military plan, even though they have agreed to scale down what they were originally intended to be a much larger operation.
Yeah, a lot to take in and a lot to keep covering. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming on. And we will keep a close eye on the situation in the Middle East and bring you any major developments as we get them. Now, coming up, we're less than 6 months away from Election Day as the former president and his potential running mates traffic in dangerous conspiracy theories about the 2024 election. That's next. Plus, we'll go from the campaign trail to the courtroom where the judge in Donald Trump's hush money trial found him in criminal contempt for a 10th time and warned Trump that he may be thrown in jail. The very latest legal developments are straight ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Election Day is less than 6 months away, and there's no shortage of action or controversy surrounding the Republican presidential nominee, Donald Trump. And I'm not just talking about his court proceedings. Over the weekend, the former president made some incendiary comments behind closed doors while hosting donors and vice presidential hopefuls in South Florida. According to audio obtained by NBC News, he said Democrats, quote, get welfare to vote, and he accused Democrats of cheating at the polls. Trump also railed against the legal troubles he and his supporters face for their efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And Trump referred to the Biden administration as, quote, a Gestapo. Meanwhile, several potential running mates took the stage with Trump, including North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. Later, Burgum's had this to say about the Gestapo remarks.
This was a short comment deep into the thing that wasn't really central to what he was talking about. But I understand and I think Americans understand, a majority of Americans feel like the trial that he's in right now is politically motivated.
So a public trial with witnesses, a jury, a defense counsel, that's like the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police?
Well, he certainly didn't say that yesterday, and he wasn't referring to this trial when he made that comment.
On Meet the Press, another VP hopeful, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, echoed Donald Trump's comments, and Senator Scott refused to tell Kristen Welker that he would commit to accepting the results of the November election. Take a listen.
Senator, will you commit to accepting the election results of 2024? Bottom line.
Well, at the end of the day, the 47th president of the United States will be President Donald Trump, and I'm excited to get back to low inflation, low unemployment.
Wait, Senator, yes or no? Yes or no? Will you accept the election results of 2024 no matter who wins?
That is my statement.
So I'm asking you as a potential VP nominee, will you accept to commit to the election results in this election cycle no matter who wins? Just simply yes or no.
I expect President Trump to win the next election. Listen, I'm not going to answer your hypothetical question when, in fact, I believe the American people are speaking today on the results of the election.
Donald Trump's conspiracy theories about the election have been embraced by large portions of the Republican Party and its base. NBC's Alex Tabet has been speaking to Republican voters at events around the country. Here's some of what he found.
In 2024, do you think there's any way Biden could legitimately, fair and square, win this election this time around?
Yeah, through cheating.
No. Are you joking? Only if the illegal election happens again.
NBC News asked 50 Trump supporters across a dozen different states the exact same question.
In 2024, do you think there's any way Joe Biden could legitimately, fair and square, win that election?
And most told us they don't believe President Biden can legitimately win re-election.
They cheat like crazy. I think they cheated before, and I think they're going to try to do it again because they're a bunch of communists that don't care.
That false message that the last election was rigged coming straight from the top.
There are books that are written on how the election was rigged. There are numerous books that were written.
And now former President Donald Trump is sowing seeds of doubt about the next election.
We want a landslide. We have to win. We have to win so that it's too big to rig. Too big to rig.
Trump supporters are parroting his skepticism, telling NBC News Biden can't legitimately win because he doesn't have a real following.
I don't think he's got a following. I mean, you look, who's behind him?
The only thing he's got is ghosts behind him.
Randall Minicola is a retired security officer from Las Vegas. He thinks it's impossible for Biden to win in November fair and square.
Where's his supporters? Then are they in the basement with him?
A big reason why so many Trump fans can't fathom Biden garnering enough support.
There's a few bubbles off center.
Because of his inability to complete a sentence.
Without mumbling or it not sounding like a sentence.
Sound familiar?
The man can't put two sentences together.
Trump supporters also expressing mistrust in voting machines, echoing unproven and outlandish allegations made by Trump's lawyers after the 2020 election.
He didn't have the votes in 2020. He will not have the votes in 2024.
Ellen Stree from Glendale, Arizona, says if Biden wins, it's because voting machines are rigged in his favor.
Any electronics, even electronic check-in is not okay.
There is no evidence of voting machine fraud, and those who peddled such claims are paying the price.
Fox agreeing to pay Dominion more than $787 million over the network's unsupported claims.
Finally, many of those we talked to admitted they might not think a Biden win is possible because of the information they're consuming.
2024, do you think he could win legitimately? No.
Davis Green, a financier from Salt Lake, pointed to his social media feed for his disbelief.
Maybe it's the bubble I'm in and the algorithm that I'm seeing, but I feel like a lot of people are fed up with being gaslighted on the economy.
My social media stuff kind of tells me what I want to hear sometimes, you know, the algorithm.
But not all those interviewed were so down on Biden's chances.
Is it theoretically possible that he might fair and square win the election? Sure, anything's possible.
A dozen of the 50, like Candy Florentine from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, said a legitimate Biden win in November is not out of the realm of possibility.
Sure, there's always a chance.
Alex Tabet, NBC News.
Our thanks to Alex for that great reporting. And to be clear, there is no evidence that the 2020 election was stolen and no evidence of widespread voter fraud. And there is also no evidence of a conspiracy theory by the White House or the Democratic Party to steal the 2024 election. Joining me now is NBC News' Dasha Burns. She spent the weekend reporting from the RNC donor retreat in Florida. So, Dasha, thank you for being here. What were the most important things you saw and heard?
Well, as you know, Yamish, NBC News obtained audio from the former president's speech at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend. And to our friend Alex's point, he did spend a lot of that speech talking about past elections, his win in 2016, and then once again claiming falsely that he won the 2020 election as well. He also railed against Jack Smith, the special counsel. He criticized what he deems as a weaponized justice system. And it was quite a profanity-laced speech. Yamish, more so than what we hear in those public speeches to voters at rallies. He also did shout out a lot of the top VP contenders. He gave a shout out to Elise Stefanik, complimenting her for grilling university presidents on the Hill. Said J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, turned out to be, quote, incredible after being a critic of the former president in 2016. Also praised Senator Scott, Senator Marco Rubio, and Byron Donalds, and Doug Burgum, the governor from North Dakota, who's kind of a dark horse, a recent addition to the short list there. He praised him for being a very wealthy man, Yamish.
A lot to think through there, Dasha. But I also want to talk about the fact that we mentioned that Trump's false claims about the 2020 election and the doubt he's really sowing about the 2024 election. You talked to RNC chairman, the new one, Michael Whatley. What did he tell you?
Yeah, he was handpicked by the former president really to focus on what they are now calling a new election integrity program. Now, that involves, they say, recruiting thousands, up to 100,000 volunteers and lawyers to actually monitor the vote process and the vote counting process around the election. But also, they are laying the groundwork right now. They say they've filed more than 80 lawsuits across 25 states targeting how mail-in ballots are counted, targeting voter rolls. I asked the chairman about this. Take a listen.
The RNC has engaged in 82 election integrity lawsuits in 25 states. What do you say to critics who argue that these lawsuits are just sort of paving the way for former President Trump to claim the election was stolen in 2024 if President Biden wins?
They're absolutely not. Look, we're trying to do through these lawsuits is get states to implement common sense election integrity programs. like making sure that we have common sense protections on mail-in voting, making sure that only citizens can vote, making sure that the states are cleaning up the voter rolls. These are things that are strongly supported by a vast majority of the American people that has nothing to do with voter suppression.
I also asked Whatley about the impact of Trump's trial on the 2024 election, and he said that while it's tough not to have more of Mr. Trump's time, that he is able to really galvanize the media attention and capitalize on that and talk to voters directly from the courtroom. Yamiche.
Well, Joshua, thanks for joining us from sunny Florida. Up next, new witnesses, including a veteran of the Trump Organization and a current employee, testify in Trump's hush money case. We have all the key highlights from day 12 of Trump's criminal trial next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Testimony has concluded for the day in Donald Trump's hush money trial. The day began with the judge issuing his strongest warning of jail time yet to Donald Trump. Judge Juan Marchand held Trump in contempt again for violating his gag order for a 10th time. He fined Trump an additional $1,000, and Marchand said this, quote, "The last thing I want to do is put you in jail. You are the former president of the United States and possibly the next president as well. But at the end of the day, I have a job to do." Trump has claimed the gag order violates his First Amendment right to free speech and addressed today's ruling moments ago as he left court.
And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
NBC News correspondent Yasmin Vasugan joins me from outside the court in Manhattan. Also with me is Barbara McQuaid, former U.S. attorney and now an NBC News legal analyst. So Yasmin, Marchand made it very clear that he could throw Trump in jail if he continues to violate this gag order. What makes this ruling different today than other previous rulings?
That he's on the brink. You read the statement there, right? That Judge Juan Marchand seems like he absolutely would make the decision to put the former president in jail if he continues to violate the gag order, saying essentially the $1,000 every time you violate the gag order is not a deterrent. It doesn't seem to be enough of a deterrent. And I would go so far as to put you in jail. The problem is one of which that you mentioned, right? You're the former president of the United States, a presumptive Republican nominee, possibly the next president of the United States, and you got Secret Service with you. So it seems as if for now the former president and his legal team have gotten the message so far. And I think back to the moment last week in which one of the former president's attorneys approached the bench and talked about the possibility of the former president reposting something that a legal analyst had put up and asking permission essentially to repost it. And Judge Juan Marchand essentially said, I'm not in the business of telling you what you should and should not post. If you think it's on the brink, if you think it's not good, then err on the safe side and just don't do it. So it seems as if for now the message has been received by the former president and his team, although we'll have to wait and see what happens.
We will have to wait and see. It'll be interesting to see what Donald Trump chooses to do. I also want to ask you about the testimony that jurors heard today. Tell me about what they heard and from who they heard it from, because apparently we had the first current employee of the Trump Organization testifying today.
Deb Tarasoff, first current employee. She's been with Trump Org for 24 years. Jeffrey McConnell also has been with the Trump Organization since 1987, no longer an employee of Trump Organization. He also testified for the Trump Organization, Trump Civil Fraud Trial, Trump Payroll Corporation as well. So this is not his first time around and sitting in that witness stand, although he was not here voluntarily. His legal fees being paid by the Trump Organization, along with Deb Tarasoff's legal fees as well. And they kind of talk through the ledgers, the invoices, the checks as well, right? 34 counts in which the former president has been indicted for falsifying business records. We saw those business records today through those ledgers, through those invoices, through those checks as well. And they kind of created a circle, right? Jeffrey essentially sending an email to Deb Tarasoff saying we need to pay Michael Cohen $35,000 a month each and every single month. Deb Tarasoff essentially cutting those checks, making sure they made their way up to Rona Graff then the former president's personal assistant in Trump Tower and/or his personal assistant in the White House outside the Oval, in which he was signing those checks over and then getting them off to Mychael Cohen, right? Every single month in the year of 2017, from January of 2017 to January of 2018, paying Mychael Cohen $35,000 a month, totaling, Yamiche, $420,000 a month, broken down $130,000 to Stormy Daniels and/or her attorney, $50,000 to a tech company, $60,000 in bonuses, and then the rest for taxes, as Alan Weisselberg had talked about with one of the witnesses that testified today. So certainly it was a slog of a day, but an incredibly important day in kind of building the case for the prosecution through all of these documents, Yamiche.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for just taking us through all of that. And Barbara, I want to come to you now. Does Judge Marchand have any options here other than that $1,000 fines that he can keep on doing? And also, of course, the option of throwing Donald Trump in jail. Is there anything else he could do?
You know, there's really not, Yasmin, and it's a shame because the statute in New York allows two options: a $1,000 fine per incident or 30 days in jail. And it doesn't really have anything in between, which is probably to the great frustration of Justice Marchand, because it would be nice to be able to use what's known as progressive discipline. You know, the first offense is $1,000, and then we go up to $5, and then maybe up to $10. Instead, his options really are $1,000 or jail, and those are some pretty extreme options. But he made it clear today that jail is a possibility, and so perhaps that will be enough to deter Donald Trump from engaging in further. But you know, he's already violated the gag order 10 times, which is an awful lot. I think that an ordinary person might already have found himself jailed for 10 violations. But as the judge made clear, I think he's very reluctant to jail someone who's running for president. But he has expressed that he is willing to do so if necessary.
What's also interesting when you think about the fact that, of course, Donald Trump is not an ordinary citizen here is the fact that he's someone who's put his mugshot on T-shirts, right? He's someone who might be a defendant who wants to be punished, given what he said outside the courtroom just a few moments ago. So how do you punish a defendant who seems to want to be punished in a situation like this? Take us through the sort of problem that Judge Marchand might have on his hands here.
You know, it's certainly something they don't teach you in law school, and I'm sure they don't teach you in judges school. The idea that somebody actually wants to be punished, it is something that's really unheard of. But I do think that there is a little bit here of what Donald Trump's strategy is to bait the judge and to try to push himself all the way up to the line, knowing that the last thing this judge wants to do is to put him in jail, because so much of Donald Trump's strategy is to portray himself as a victim, and it's all about grievance, and it's all about victimhood. If he should be jailed, it really just plays right into that strategy. But I think if you're a judge, you can't be afraid to do the right thing just because someone is baiting you or might be benefited or they want you to do that. You still have to do the right thing. And so if Donald Trump continues to violate this order with impunity, I think the judge will have no choice but to jail him. And that's because it isn't about punishing Donald Trump so much as it is protecting the integrity of these proceedings, protecting the witnesses, court personnel, and jurors. And the judge has an obligation to do that.
So do we think the next violation might lead to Donald Trump actually being in jail? And then what happens after jail if he gets out and keeps doing this?
I think then he goes to jail for longer. You know, the first offense might be overnight. It's a 30-day limit. And so the judge could use sort of aggravated, escalating levels of punishment for each one of these offenses. One would hope that one day in jail would be enough to get people to comply with a gag order. But if it doesn't, then I think the judge has the ability to use progressive discipline to increase that number. And, you know, the idea about Donald Trump as a Secret Service protectee not being able to be jailed, I think is nonsense. I think he can be jailed. It might have to be in a federal facility. It might have to be in a facility that's guarded by the Secret Service, but that can be done. It just means that he is detained for whatever period of time the judge orders.
Yeah. Well, Barbara, thank you so much. And after the break, thank you. And after the break, campaigns and courtrooms will dig deeper into the state of the 2024 race. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, from Mar-a-Lago to the airwaves, it appears the Trump Veepstakes competition is in full swing. Joining me now to dig into all of this is our panel, Mychael Schnell, a congressional reporter for The Hill, Juanita Tolliver, Democratic strategist and an NBC News political analyst, and Rick Tyler, also an NBC News political analyst and a Republican strategist. So thank you all for being here. So, Mychael, it's May. We've seen the benefits of sort of things getting busy and us having things to cover when it comes to the VP. But I wonder, when you think about sort of how Donald Trump is looking at this, is it beneficial to him to have a sort of reality TV show VP competition? And is it really even important who he picks as much as it's how this person is going to sort of turn into Donald Trump and integrate themselves into the way that he sees all things, including, of course, the 2020 and 2024 election?
Yeah, well, whether or not it's beneficial, I think that is clearly the way that the former president is going to take this. That's sort of his style. We've seen that in the past. And I mean, we saw that this weekend with that RNC retreat, how all these potential VP candidates funneling into Mar-a-Lago to have this conversation. And look, I think that, as we know, something that's really important to the former president, despite it being for the individual helms, what sort of experience they have that can fill holes in his resume, it's loyalty. And that's why we're seeing so much conversation about relitigating the question of the 2020 presidential election, because something that the former president wants and prioritizes is this unfettered loyalty. He wants to see who he's going to get that from within these candidates. I think that's why that's the conversation that's been dominating, rather than traditionally what you talk about, the state that the person's from or their past background.
To that point about loyalty, though, I'm wondering why anyone would want this job after he publicly painted a target on Mike Pence's back on January 6th. That's literally what people are signing up for. And so as they go out and they make these points, regurgitate a lot of the conspiracy theories that Trump wants them to say, they're debasing themselves for what? A threat on their physical safety, potentially?
Well, it's a good question. And I wonder, Rick, when you watch someone like Senator Tim Scott, Kristen Welker tried as much as she could to ask the follow-up question over and over again, and he never got around to saying that he would accept the election results. What's the significance of that? And what does it tell us about sort of where things are going if already the 2024 election is sort of already up in the air in terms of whether or not they'll say it's a fair election?
They all noted that the chief counsel of the RNC was fired recently because he was... He stated the obvious, which is, why are we spending a lot of time relitigating an election that wasn't stolen? And so that's where they have to contort themselves to be. It seems sort of axiomatic, and I know the press has to ask it, but the idea that we have to ask whether you're accepting the results of the election seems absurd. Look, there's only two reasons to pick, or two important reasons to pick a vice president. Nobody remembers the president's names, vice president's names. They don't go down in history unless they become president themselves. And that is to fill a hole in the resume, which you would need many, many, many people to fill that. And the second would be a state that they bring, and a political operation in a state that brings electors to the balance. So, for instance, Obama was picked Joe Biden precisely because he had a foreign policy expertise. He was from Delaware. He didn't get it. There was no benefit electorally for that. So you would want someone, obviously, from a state, from the other party, where you could pick the electoral votes. They're not going to get that. So I don't know. It's a parlor game.
Can I also ask you, Juanita, a smart question that I was going to ask, which is, why does anybody want this job to be VP for Donald Trump?
People often ask me, do people are running? They're running for VP, right? And I'm always like, no, I know these people. They all think they could be president. Nobody runs for VP. But now that we have a nominee, people vie for the vice presidential, because the vice presidential position is the best position you can be in going into the next election. So it's much easier to be vice president and run for president, because if that term is successful, then that gets accrued often to the vice president, and they'll want to continue on. So it's politically a very beneficial position to be in.
And Mychael, I want to ask you, Donald Trump has been able to defy political gravity, especially when it comes to his legal cases and the fact that he was able to still become the Republican nominee. I wonder, does that give him free rein to just sort of do whatever comes next here, especially as we hear him even outside the courthouse saying, yeah, put me in jail, maybe I'll just do that and see what happens?
I think it depends on how you define free rein and what the benefit and the goal is there. Because if you're talking about revving up his base, getting more constituents to support his candidacy, then yes, because we saw after each one of those 4 indictments, he went up in the polls, despite the former president being in court 4 days a week right now, not being on the campaign trail. It's not affecting him in the polls. He's essentially neck and neck with Biden in the national polls and in a number of these battleground states. So he sees this, I would presume that he sees this as a winning strategy throughout his entire career in politics. He's tried to make himself look like the victim. That's been something that has resonated with his base. This is a perfect opportunity to run with that messaging, which is why I think that we see him continuing to do that. And, you know, as he continues to navigate these different legal proceedings, that I don't think that he's going to let up on it, because for him, it's been a winning strategy.
And Juanita, I mean, what would be the political impact if we do see Donald Trump go to jail? Especially, like I said, there was the mugshot picture. You can just imagine he might come out with a diss track. A lot of us were dealing with that this weekend. But I wonder what you make of the fact that there could be a political impact to him being thrown in jail, that he wants to be there.
Of course there would be a political impact, but it would be confined to the people already with him, who have been undeterred with each of these 94 criminal charges that he's facing at the federal and state levels. And with that in mind, I think about a general election where that support is capped. And this is the opportunity that the Biden campaign has to really leverage. And thinking about what their closing message over the next 6 months should be, it should be the same thing it was in 2020. Keep that guy out. We know exactly what he wants if he regains control of the Oval Office and the power of the presidency. Just keep him out, because 2020 was about avoiding a second Trump term. That's the proposition that I think a lot of voters will respond to in 2024 as well.
I hope that's not the... I mean, look, Biden needs to do 2 things. He needs to convince the American people that the economy is actually as good as it is, and that they feel it and they don't want to go back to the chaos of millions of jobs lost and hundreds of thousands and millions of businesses closed when Trump totally mishandled COVID. And he's got to do something on the border. Perception is everything here. People now perceive that the border is out of control. People are feeling it in their communities. They feel like all the reasons. But Biden has the resources and he has the authorization to get the border under control. And I think that would be a big advantage to him.
But I want to also read to you what Jeff Duncan, who's the former lieutenant governor of Georgia, wrote. In part, he wrote that the GOP will never rebuild until we move on from the Trump era. He said, this November, I am voting for a decent person I disagree with on policy over a criminal defendant without a moral compass. He's voting for President Biden. I know you're talking about the border there, but here's a Republican saying, I just can't do this and I'm going to vote for Biden because he's a decent person. What do you make of that?
I think there's a lot of people like that. It's surprisingly fewer than I would have thought. But I've often argued that the conservative position is not to vote for Trump, because Trump is not a conservative. He's a populist. And all around the world where I work with different governments in training, the populist movement always fails. It can never be sustained. And Trump is running as a populist. He doesn't have a core governing philosophy. And his philosophy is himself. And if you want Trump to be in charge of himself, look, I'm all for benevolent dictatorships, except the dictator always dies, and that's where the trouble always comes from. Yeah. So this is the second best we have, which is a constitutional republic. We ought to take care of it, and we ought to not put people who willfully break the law.
Yeah, well, Mychael, Juanita, Rick, thank you so much for talking all this through. And still to come, Columbia calls it off inside the university's decision to cancel its school-wide commencement ceremony after weeks of protests and turmoil. We're live on campus next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. After weeks of turmoil on campus, Columbia University has decided to cancel its university-wide commencement ceremony scheduled for next week. The decision comes less than a week after the NYPD in riot gear cleared Hamilton Hall on the Columbia campus, where protesters had barricaded themselves. It also comes after the LAPD cleared protesters at the University of Southern California over the weekend, and after police made dozens of arrests after protesters clashed with officers at the University of Virginia on Saturday. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton joins me now from near the Columbia University campus. So thank you so much, Antonio, for being here. So from my understanding, Columbia University was maintaining a police presence on campus. How did Columbia come to the decision to cancel its commencement?
Well, Yamiche, you're exactly right. And that police presence is going to be here until May 17th. That's 2 days after May 15th, which was supposed to be this classic commencement ceremony. What we're going to see happen now is they're going to focus on these smaller school-specific ceremonies, things like the engineering school, the journalism school. And this comes after days of debate among administrators and student government leaders about what would be most safe, but also some concern about what it would mean for the president, who has been so much at the center of the concern and tension on campus. Take a listen to a conversation I had with one parent who is really hurting over this announcement.
Well, a lot of us, when you don't have high school graduation pictures, and then you're not going to really have college graduation, when they had a really horrible beginning online, and then they also, you know, didn't have high school graduation, most of them. Parents are not okay with it, I would say. Your whole point was to have it here.
We spoke with a number of students today on and off campus who described a lot of what you just heard right there, that they're the class of 2020, they graduated in their cars or on Zoom. This was supposed to be their moment. They're now going to have to find other ways to have that iconic kind of imagery, that feeling of camaraderie, Yamiche, and it certainly means that there's still that pain and that tension after all the protests here on campus.
Certainly a tough situation. You could see it in that parent's voice and her face there. So thank you, Antonia, for continuing on this story. And tomorrow we'll be back with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.